Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Jennifer Groman, and I am the Higher Education Division Chair for the Ohio Association for Gifted Children, and I am an Associate Professor at Ashland University. At Ashland, we have a Master's in Curriculum and Instruction with an emphasis on talent development education, and we have a Gifted Intervention Specialist endorsement program as well. And the Master's does come with the gifted endorsement. You are now in my session called The Challenge and Promise of Creative Underachievers. And I would like to welcome you and thank you for coming to my session. So I'll have my presentation first, and then at the end, if you are watching this live or synchronous with the conference, you'll be able to do some question and answer afterward. So without further ado, let's talk about the challenge and promise of creative underachievers. The Challenge and Promise of Creative Underachievers is a book chapter in an edited volume called Underachievement in Gifted Education, Perspectives, Practices, and Possibilities, soon to be released by Routledge, and the editors are Collins, Robertson, and Pisk. My conclusion actually is something I'm going to give you first, so that while you watch my presentation, you can get a sense of what I mean by there being a mismatch between the traditional school culture and the personality and working style of creative individuals, which can often bring on underachievement. So while I talk about the different aspects of school and creative individuals and teachers, see if you can see that mismatch between the traditional school culture and the creative individuals I'm talking about. I'm using as an illustration of a very creative underachiever the cartoon character Calvin of Calvin and Hobbes. So if you are not familiar with Calvin and Hobbes, there's Calvin over there. So long, Pop, I'm off to check my tiger trap. He sets his tiger trap and he catches a tiger, and this is Hobbes. And Hobbes turns out to be his stuffed tiger and best friend. Bill Watterson is the cartoonist, and he actually lived in Chagrin Falls, so he is an Ohio boy, and he is the cartoonist, and I would consider him a creative achiever, but a little bit of an underachiever, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But I'm going to use Calvin as my poster boy for creative underachievers. You can see that when Calvin's mother puts Hobbes, the stuffed tiger, into the washing machine, he is a stuffed toy. And you can see at the end of the comic strip, when Calvin is talking to him, that he becomes a real tiger. So the existential question of Calvin and Hobbes is Hobbes a stuffed toy or a real animal? And this is Bill Watterson. And believe me, I tried to find a more recent picture of Bill Watterson. But he has done something in the 21st century that is unheard of. He has absolutely no online presence. Do you know how challenging that is to not have an online presence? So I found about 4 pictures of him back in the 1980s and nothing recent. But this is Bill Watterson. He is the creator and cartoonist of Calvin and Hobbes. You may wonder where the names Calvin and Hobbes come from. When Watterson was creating names for the characters of his comic strip, he decided on the Protestant reformer John Calvin as Calvin and the social philosopher Thomas Hobbes as Hobbes. Allegedly, he was paying homage to Kenyon's political science department. He went to Kenyon College where he majored in political science. The cartoon Calvin and Hobbes ran from November 1985 to November 1995, only 10 short years. Over time, he became quite critical of comic strips and the whole system behind comic strips. And for years, Watterson battled against the pressure from publishers to merchandise his work, especially displaying Calvin and Hobbes images on mugs or stickers or t-shirts. He felt like it would devalue the characters and their personalities. As a result, he became very media shy. After the comic strip ended in 1995, he pretty much disappeared from public life. He did write a short piece in 1999 for the LA Times about the retirement of Charles Schulz, who created the Peanuts characters. One might consider that Watterson is an underachiever because he created this very insightful cartoon, these very interesting characters, very different from what we had seen before. And he was doing very well. He was very successful for 10 years. But he, over time, began to rebel against the system that oversees comic strips. So the editors all wanted him to go in the direction of marketing the images of Calvin and Hobbes and making dolls or t-shirts or stickers and things like that. And he just felt like it was not in his best interest to make money off of these characters in that way. So he felt like they were taking advantage of him. So he stepped away from the field and all but disappeared. You're going to see, as we start looking at underachievers, that there's a mismatch. As I said earlier, there's a mismatch between the way schools work and the way gifted individuals work. Well, there was obviously a huge mismatch between how Watterson viewed the field, how it should be, and his personal philosophy and personality, and the way the field actually worked. So he just completely rebelled against it and checked out of the entire field. So that's why I say I think there's a part of him that is an underachiever. And he exhibits those behaviors of rebellion against a system that we see in creative underachievers. So what I'm going to do next is compare and contrast 21st century schools and the creative individuals so that you can see that mismatch I talked about. At the end, I'll also talk a little bit about 21st century teachers as well and see where they fit in the mix. So first, I'm going to describe 21st century schools. One of the words that comes up most often when we look at 21st century schools in the literature is the word rigid. Rigid divisions of learning environments, we base this on age. Rigid divisions of time, like the school year, the semester, the school day, very rigid divisions of this time. Rigid schedules, rigid but fairly arbitrary assessment structures or grades of students. Rigid categories of student diversity, demographics, gender. Rigid rule structures, dress codes, and behavior codes. So you can see 21st century schools are structured around rigidity. More rigid standardization of content, rigid standardization of pace. We're seeing this more and more. Standardization of accountability assessments, especially those types of assessments we use to identify gifted individuals. We see a separation of language arts, math, science, social studies. These are all delegated to a specific amount of time. Unfortunately, oversight and legislation comes from non-educators, focusing on raising struggling students rather than traditional students and gifted students as being equal. Seating in rows or table groups that are hard to kind of maneuver around or adjust for grouping. And those good old single file lines. So let's take a look at Calvin as a creative individual. You can see that he is working very diligently, so he has a great deal of task commitment when it interests him. His attention to detail, they have little eyes and little arms. Everyone is uniform in size. His thinking is definitely unconventional. He's a unique problem solver with a vivid imagination and off-the-wall humor. A few more characteristics of the creative individual. Independent, very intuitive, thinks with their gut instinct and acts impulsively. Not always motivated by grades. They do not like repetition unless it interests them. They don't really need repetition to learn something or learn facts. They make those mental leaps, but they can't always explain how they got there. They love to explore ideas, and hands-on materials are their favorite way to learn. And they enjoy fantasy, and they see unusual uses for everyday objects. They have deeper feelings and a wider range of emotional expression. They're original in their thinking. They're very curious, can be very humorous or witty, not always in a good way. They are non-conforming, divergent in their thought processes. They don't really have any inhibitions when it comes to self-exploration or self-expression. They can be overly sensitive or moody, and oftentimes their energy or behaviors are misconstrued as playing rather than doing serious work tasks. And of course, asynchrony is big with the creative individual. So you can see that 21st century schools are very convergent. It's thinking together. It's working as a team. It's always doing the same thing at the same time. Very rigid, very structured. You can see that creative individuals are extremely divergent. They are thinking out of the box. They are nonconformist. They are not rigid in their thinking. In fact, they don't want to think in a rigid way. So you can see that these are not terribly compatible. Hence my conclusion that there is a mismatch between traditional school culture and the personality and working style of creative individuals. Calvin has a very vivid imagination, which often runs away with him, until the convergent teacher brings him back to reality. Almost. One of the characteristics that revealed itself the most in the literature as a challenge to the creative child in school is the behavioral manifestations of the conformity and nonconformity dichotomy. Highly creative students enjoy the risk of the unknown, and the underachieving creative child may often seem driven to being unique and determined to attract attention to that uniqueness. In direct contrast to the wishes of most teachers who prefer conforming, acquiescing students, creative students ask unusual questions, put forth innovative ideas, and prefer divergent thinking during traditional discussions and activities. Some creative children resist conformity of the traditional classroom by being rebellious or being disruptive or questioning the teacher quite openly and indiscreetly. Peers also tend to demand conformity to gain acceptance. That constant push-pull of the creative child's wishes for self-expression and uniqueness against the expectations of conformity, that creates this deep unhappiness, which shows itself in misbehavior and even withdrawal. Because of their desire for conformity, some teachers may even misidentify the unconventional behavior that's usually associated with creative children as ADHD. In addition, it was found that some achieving elementary gifted students who are not challenged in the classroom may begin to voice complaints against boring work and teachers who don't like them. As a result, older students may develop oppositionality against conventional authority. And as you can see, Calvin has absolutely no trouble telling his teacher how he feels about the lessons. It appears in the literature that highly creative students exhibit these characteristics that many teachers find undesirable. So research into specific characteristics of creative children would indicate that teachers see children as problem causers who are impulsive, emotionally conflictive, overly sensitive, negative or pessimistic, can be withdrawn or moody, reluctant to take on challenging work, troublemaker, not really risk takers, and rebellious. And we know that highly creative individuals and highly creative children love taking on challenges. They are risk takers and they want to call attention to themselves and the good parts of themselves. But when they are deemed a troublemaker, pessimistic, or called sensitive, then they hang back and they tend to suppress their creative urges and they don't take on challenges and they don't want to take risks. In 2019, I presented some research on creativity and teachers' perceptions of the characteristics of creative children at the Ohio Association for Gifted Children's Fall Conference that year. And I saw in Ohio teachers, they believed that there were some positive characteristics of creative children, like being original and they're out-of-the-box thinkers. And they used the word fluency, which is a word that we find from creative problem solving. They have high curiosity and they're very witty. The negative characteristics tended to balance out the positive. So teachers in Ohio tend to think that creative children are belligerent. They lack follow-up. They tend to act like clowns. They don't always follow directions, and they tend to be a troublemaker. We know that when gifted students are included in programs that support and encourage their creativity and their giftedness, they become highly creative. But if needs are not met, these creative individuals can develop into underachievers. Sometimes, because of their behaviors, creatively gifted students are kept out of gifted programming. So when they are kept out of gifted programming, they learn often to suppress their creative impulses. They also see peer pressure that makes creative children feel that their unique way of thinking and being makes them socially undesirable or even weird. In our peer-oriented culture of schools, children can often be afraid to think until they learn what their classmates are thinking. They are sensitive to negative feedback, and they're actually afraid of being laughed at for their unusual attempts and responses. That may make creative students withdraw into fantasy, which is a real safe place for them, and it's much more rewarding and accepting than the real world. They could also withdraw into fantasy if fear being laughed at, or if things are not done their way. Creativity guru E. Paul Torrance called highly creative children creatively handicapped because their creativity makes it difficult to achieve in the traditional classroom. He even suggested that a new category be added to special education for this unique group. I think you can definitely see that mismatch between the traditional school culture and the personality and the working style of these creative children. Next, I'm going to talk to you about some supports that we can use to help the creative underachiever. In this cartoon, you can see Calvin acting like a non-producer by choice and by rebellion. So enjoy this comic strip for just a moment. When faced with the choice of hard work or sitting back and letting the work get done for them, the non-producer makes the choice to non-produce. So there are two types of underachievers. There are underachievers and non-producers. Underachievers may require longer-term efforts, coordinated efforts between school, home, and a counselor or a psychologist. Non-producers are usually underachieving by choice or by rebellion against a system that doesn't really understand them or against a system where they don't fit. This is very close to how I described Bill Watterson, isn't it? So some of the things we can do, we can give them a less restrictive school setting, whatever that might look like in your classroom. Periodic open times to do things on their own or to go at their own pace. Giving them time and support to pursue topics of interest, especially the strong interest. And focusing on independence, stressing choice, stressing self-monitoring, and self-exploration. We can also avoid excess competition. allow students to sometimes advance at their own pace. And it's important to create these non-threatening environments to allow students, all students, to explore creative ideas, to explore more than one problem approach, and also to making mistakes as part of the learning process. Our creative individuals also really thrive on having tutors or mentors that have a high understanding or intellectual ability in the area of interest for that creative individual. Librarians, parents, teens, older students can be good tutors or mentors to these students. It's important to encourage students to have intrinsic motivation, to work and take pride in the work that they're doing without rewards. And this is an example of what we sometimes do to creative thinkers, divergent thinkers, students who are gifted, especially very active students who are gifted. At one point, they put Calvin on medication. It doesn't last very long in the comic strip, but here's the result. With that in mind, my second conclusion here is that there is a mismatch between school culture, that traditional school culture, and the personality and working style of creative teachers. My dissertation was on teacher burnout, and I talked to 3 teachers. I did an in-depth study of 3 teachers and spent a weekend with them talking about some of the challenges and the critical incidents and the crises that they went through simply by being someone who thinks a little bit more flexibly and pushes against the traditional system. So let's take a look at 21st century teachers. As you know, you've experienced it. You are in constant thinking on your feet mode, that improvisation that creative people are actually pretty good at, but it can be exhausting, especially if you're an introvert. But most of our day is spent constantly interacting with students. We don't get a lot of downtime. Speaking of downtime, these are minimal, and sometimes we are asked to do other duties during break and lunch times. Or sometimes we do those other duties ourselves. Instead of being asked, we invite students into our classrooms at lunchtime to spend some quality time, some counseling time with our students. All of the things that we are expected to do except for teach happens beyond the working day. Grading, planning, PD, meetings, collaboration, and conferences. And of course, the substandard pay compared with how much education we have and continuing education, and the financial commitment of higher education, and just time in the field and experience in the field. And you got to face it. Right now, especially in 2023, we are working within a divisive culture. Some of the public denigrate the profession. Some respect it, even revere it. But everyone who's not in this profession, they think they understand teaching because they were students at one point. So they think they know what teaching's all about. You know, you spend a lot of money on your classroom throughout the year. Many of us feel called to the profession. When I've taught undergraduates, and I do an activity at the beginning asking them, what brought them to the profession. And I have them go around the room. There are papers all over the room with different things that might have brought them to the profession, like a mentor who suggested it, or being called to the profession, or because they get summers off. And most of my undergraduates felt called to the profession. And because of that, we tend to endure a lot that we wouldn't normally endure if we didn't feel called. Most teachers work within a system they know is not a best fit for their students. Parker Palmer calls these crossed purposes. We work within a system, but we know that system does not fit our students, and it doesn't fit us. This is the kind of system we tend to fight against because we know this is not a best fit for students. And because of everything else in our world, we are taking on counselor roles, parenting roles. We, of course, are teaching in and out of the classroom, nurse, mediator, caregiver, reporter of abuse. Some of these are very emotional roles as well. And I work at a university, and I know undergraduate work does not prepare our pre-service teachers for gifted students, and it definitely doesn't prepare them for creative students. So I think you can see how my second conclusion really hits the mark. There really is a mismatch between our school culture and the personality and working style of good creative teachers. A lot of my teachers that I work with in the AU program will say they're creative teachers, but they won't say they're creative people. They'll say, I'm not very creative except in my teaching. And that's a pretty powerful statement to make. They've relegated their creative energies to teaching and learning within a system that doesn't really support anything outside of the box. I'm going to show you some of these characteristics of 21st century schools, and let's take a look and consider how we might adapt our schools to open up a little bit for the creative individuals that work within it. How can we adapt this rigid division of learning environments based on age? We do that when we accelerate. We change the learning environment of students based on what they need. Rigid divisions of learning time. That is also very appropriate with acceleration. Some students go through things more quickly. Some students need more time and more repetition. How can we get a little more flexible when it comes to transitions? We know that some of our gifted students, especially those that get very involved, are similar to ADH students where they don't like transitions. It takes them a long time to transition. So we can learn some techniques to get students ready to move on to the next thing. When it comes to grading, we can differentiate our assessment structure for students who are moving faster or moving more deeply doing enrichment work. And we can also involve students in the assessments, have them reflect on the work that they've done, have them self-assess their knowledge, their comfort level with the material. We are seeing now an opening of categories, especially when it comes to gender. So stay tuned. Those kinds of things, we'll just see how those grow and how those change. We are looking more since COVID at diversity, especially social economic status and students in poverty. I do think sometimes we need to revisit our rigid rule structures and dress code and behavior code. Maybe not as much behavior code, but I went to a school last semester, and as you can see, I have blue hair. And I went into a school, and students were all staring at me. I did have one little guy with purple hair walk up to me and say, I like your hair. And I told him I liked his. But the teacher came up to me later and said that they just changed the dress code so that individuals with wild or bright colored hair could actually attend school. So had I gone to that school to observe my graduate level student a couple of months prior to when I did, I may not have been within the dress code. Let's consider some other ways we can adapt our schools. I know that our system standardizes content, but I also know that teachers do not. We are being asked to teach the same content at the same time as the other grade level classes. But we know that that's not best. So we very rarely will do that unless we've got someone in observing us. This is something also that acceleration can do. Pre-assessing our students before we teach a unit or teach a lesson to see who needs it and who can skip right over it. Not a lot we can do about these, especially when it comes to ODE's identification instruments, but we can begin to do some research on what accountability assessments might step outside of this standardized box. We already do this when it comes to visual and performing arts gifted. While the rubrics are standardized, the assessment and the process really individualizes, and it respects those students and their unique abilities. Interdisciplinary units definitely are something that we have been doing for decades, generations. I'm not sure that administration that this is something they really want, but I know that teachers in the classroom, this is exactly what we do. We show students how math is associated with science and social studies. Not sure what we can do about that. I'll let you sit with that one. And we are all, if you are in this session, you are definitely adapting to this kind of structure that we work within. You are focused on raising all students, and a focus on gifted students is in your area of expertise. I've been in classrooms and I've seen some really interesting shifts in how students sit. I went into one classroom last semester. They had little wobble seats that were on the floor and a floor height table that students could sit at. They had balls. They had traditional chairs and wobbly chairs. It was really cool just to see how teachers are really stepping outside of the box. Sometimes those are done by grants, and sometimes some of that stuff is done from our own wallet. How can teachers adapt to the creative individual? I'm going to give you a number of characteristics that we talked about that were creative underachievers. What we can do to take care of students when they dislike repetition. They're very interested and committed to tasks when it interests them. They want to be more independent, and we want them to work to be unmotivated by grades. We can adjust our teaching to include interest-based projects and open-ended problems that require them to really think and interact with real-world challenges. For these students, the unconventional, the ones who are divergent with great imaginations, great original responses, it's important that we create a safe environment for making mistakes and unusual responses. This is something we are really talking about now in the field of education when it comes to resilience, persistence, and growth mindset. One of the things we can do is teach self-regulation. We can also use small group discussions to talk about some of the things that are going on in gifted children's lives. We can do a dialogue that talks to students about what is it like to be gifted? What are the expectations of parents, the expectations of teachers, the expectations that you have on yourself? I have 2 suggestions for books you can use to teach you how to facilitate dialogues with your gifted students in small groups or whole class. The Essential Guide to Talking with Gifted Teens by Jean Peterson. There are a lot of different editions out, so you can find any edition. There's a brand new edition as well, and it's called Get Gifted Kids Talking. Then Christine Fonseca, who came to one of the OAGC conferences a couple of years ago, I'm Not Just Gifted. That is more for the younger student, grades 4 to 7, and very adaptable to even much younger students. These are 2 great books to give you a structure and lessons that you can use to talk to gifted kids and to get them thinking and talking about self-regulation and their feelings, their emotions, their awareness of others. This is something we know that gifted children really need, and our creative underachievers even more. And of course, I have to include Self-Regulation in the Classroom by Richard Cash, our keynote speaker
for this conference. Great book, very practical.
At the end of this presentation, I give you an article that I wrote on the long-term effects of creativity training on teachers. And I found that professional development and learning more about creative processes and your own creative processes and your own creativity gives you a really great way, a different way of seeing those creative individuals. You can identify them. You can identify with them. You can work with them. You can really respect some of the behaviors that they are exhibiting. So I believe professional development is very important in experiencing, recognizing, and supporting creativity in the classroom and their own lives. If you'd like more information on this, my email address is at the end, and I would love to talk to you about some PD in creativity or even coursework in creativity. Another longer-term suggestion is to teach children self-regulation, and that's recognizing times and places for their creative responses. What Kaufman and Beghetto call creative metacognition, and I give you an article on this as well at the end of this presentation. Kaufman and Beghetto talk about giving kids the opportunity to think before they do something inappropriate. We have to talk about creativity. It's novelty of thought, yes, and novelty of doing, but also task appropriateness is a very powerful aspect of good creativity. And task appropriateness means that children need to learn that self-regulation. And when it's appropriate to make that little joke or to respond in this way that might take the class in a different direction. And self-regulation is also, it's a very healthy balance of creativity, individuality, and knowing when to conform. This is good for us to know as well. Knowing when to conform and when not to conform. Sometimes we know something is not good for kids. And that's when we make the decision to step outside the expectations and the rules and do things the way we know they should be done. You can tell I really believe in this. This is a very powerful solution. These two suggestions are very powerful in changing your teaching and changing the way you react and interact with all students, but especially your creative underachievers. Here are my resources with links specifically to the different articles. And if it's a book, I give you a link to Amazon so you can see that book. Here's the Considering the Long-Term Transformative Impact of Creativity Training on the Work and Lives of Teachers. And the Kaufman and Beghetto, I think you'll really like, In Praise of Clark Kent, Creative Metacognition and the Importance of Teaching Kids When Not to Be Creative. A couple of other things on underachievement. Jim Delisle, an Ohio guy, and of course, Todd Stanley. I find this to be a great book to put into teachers' hands. Very practical. Thank you so much for attending my session or for viewing my session on the challenge and promise of creative underachievers. Okay, that's it. I'm through. If you are here live, what questions do you have? I will be available. I think it's in the chat, but I'm not exactly sure.